Hi, everyone. Today I'm with Jonathan Bryce, who is the Executive Director of OpenStack. OpenStack is this invisible layer that is empowering billions of people's connected experiences, which is very cool. So I want to start by hearing about your background and how you became interested in cloud computing.
Sure. So my background is really kind of on the software development and systems engineering side. I started programming when I was a kid. I had a computer in the house and was, really cool and spent all my time learning to program when I was like 8 or 9 years old. And I actually never thought that was going to be something that I did professionally. I thought I was going to be a musician, but then I discovered that people were much more willing to pay for computer programming than for clarinet players, and basically, ended up kind of getting sidetracked into technology and specifically into kind of the computing infrastructure. This is back in the 90s, and I started a company. It got acquired into a bigger company called Rackspace that did hosting and managed services, and cloud computing was what my company did. And so kind of ended up through this, not really a planned path, but ended up really early on building out cloud computing infrastructure and just, a lot of software and systems engineering that goes along with that.
Yeah. And OpenStack is open sourced. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a bit about your decision to make it open source?
Sure. So at Rackspace, we had a cloud computing division. It was the fastest growing part of the company. But at the same time, there were companies like Amazon who were getting into the business that had really deep pockets and a lot of capital to spend. And we had a set of people within the company that had some experience with open source. Rackspace really started out running Linux servers and really the LAMP stack overall. So Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. And so as a company, we had seen the way that you could take open source bits that were available to everyone and create a service and add operations and support and other value on top and build a really good business. In the cloud, we were having to build tons of software. We were doing it on our own. It wasn't really our area of expertise. And some people within the company started saying, well, what if we open source this and we create kind of a broader consortium of companies who work on this together, make it open source. We, Rackspace, will compete on service and support and operations, kind of our strong points. Yeah. And that was what led to going down that path. At the time, Rackspace was a publicly traded company, so this was a pretty big decision, and we had to make a good case for our board of directors to convince them that taking a rapidly growing business that was 100 million plus in revenue and taking the IP that we had built and making it available to everybody was a good idea, and that was something that took some time. And I know that you have previously spoken with Mark Collier, who's the COO at the OpenStack Foundation. He was one of the kind of leading proponents of that in Rackspace and going and making the case internally that this was something to do. Another person that we were working with at that time was Jason Seitz, who had started a company called SliceHost. It was like a VPS company. And then we had the president of Rackspace, Lou Morman, who really very strategic thinker. He got this, I think, got the vision really early on. He had a kind of this philosophy that I think is really relevant in the open source world, which he used to always say, there's no such thing as a long-term technical advantage. Just because it's too easy to copy anything that anybody else does. And with the way that the technology world moves, the cycles and the speed at which that happens just gets faster and faster and faster. Yeah. And so if you think that you're going to build some killer feature and nobody else is going to have that for years and years or decades, and you're going to build kind of like a company around that, then you're fooling yourself. And so why not open source? And if what you need to do is you need to move faster, then bring a bunch of people together and work on it collectively, and you all benefit from kind of this base layer, and you find ways to compete and add value on top of it. So was kind of some of the thought process going into it.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously it was successful, but was that the line of reasoning that convinced the board of directors to allow this to become an open source thing?
Yeah, I think, the thing that within Rackspace that made sense was, our kind of first, generation of growth as a company was built around open source technologies. Mm. So clearly we didn't need to own a technology in order to build a profitable company off of it. I think that another piece of it was at some level, the idea of building a technology was kind of foreign to the business overall. So in some ways, I think laying out that vision was something that was almost more comfortable for some of the people who had been in the business for a long time, because it meant that we weren't trying to be kind of an R&D and a software company. We were getting back to our roots. Yeah.
And so what are fast forwarding now to OpenStack, what are some of the bigger use cases of it, or more interesting use cases of it? Because you're talking about something that's so low level that it's hard for me to kind of wrap my mind around how it's being used.
I know it is it's very interesting for us to look at kind of the world now with OpenStack in it versus back then. When we started our cloud business, this was in 2005. We open sourced OpenStack in 2010, so just about a decade ago now. And during that time period, that 5-year time period, what everybody was doing was focusing on how do we automate virtual machines. That was really like almost the entire scope of cloud computing back then. Amazon launched in I think February of 2006 with S3, which was their storage system, and then in October of that year they came out with EC2, which was their virtual machine system. And so that was kind of the scope of cloud computing. How do you virtualize? How do you automate that? How do you make it self-service? And then how do you come up with some new kinds of storage that are almost unlimited in scaling? And that was really where OpenStack started in 2010. We had 2 projects. Nova was the compute project. Swift was the storage project. We had somewhere around 25 software developers. And what I think in our minds at that time, what we thought we were going to do was enable a lot of people to build systems similar to the Rackspace Cloud Servers product, or the Rackspace Cloud Storage product, or Amazon EC2 or S3. And if you fast forward to where we are now, we have thousands of organizations who are running clouds that do just an incredible breadth of things. Some of them are definitely just big pools of virtualization, but some of them are filled with GPUs or FPGAs, and they're doing accelerated machine learning for AI use cases.
Interesting.
Some of them are entirely bare metal clouds. Verizon Media, which came out of the acquisition of Yahoo, they run an OpenStack environment that has about 400,000 physical servers in it.
Wow.
And they use it to manage the actual physical hardware in their data center. If you have 400,000 servers, you can't go and, roll a card up to it and plug it in and, log into the Linux prompt and update software. You have to think about it as kind of this fleet that you're managing in bulk.
Yeah.
And so, that's another incredible use case. Financial services companies like Amex and China Union Pay, which is the largest card processor in the world, they process billions of transactions on top of an OpenStack environment that they've built to be secure and compliant for their use case. I have many use cases and examples. I think that one of the earliest ones when we first started to go, wait a minute, what we're actually dealing with here is kind of generalized technology, was in about 2014. We had a speaker from AT&T who gave a keynote at one of our events, and he talked about basically how in the future all of the mobile networks were going to run on top of clouds. And in order to do that, we needed to think about clouds not as just these kind of virtual machine centric environments where everything was commoditized. Part of the promise of cloud is we're going to create this simple menu. Everything is going to look the same. It's all going to be commodity. The hardware doesn't matter. The network doesn't matter. None of this stuff matters because it's all just automated and it's all virtualized. And he was kind of like, we want the benefits of that, which are speed, self-service, automation, scalability. But we have specific needs with specific types of hardware and geolocation and these kinds of things that aren't going to be met just by a Rackspace cloud or an AWS and so I think like at that point was the first time that I remember going like, okay, people are really going to do wildly different things than what we thought of. And that's part of what's so awesome about open source. When you put it out there and you invite people in, they come up with ideas that you're never going to come up with. They are going to go take it and use it in ways that you never would have thought of. So yeah, I think it's been a very interesting journey to see it move from just big data centers and virtualization to back where hardware matters, location matters, edge computing in kind of small environments, telco clouds, financial services clouds, all this kind of stuff is really cool.
Yeah. So they're all attracted to this technology. Is it because it is open source, or is it because of a feature set that they can't find somewhere else?
So I think that the answer is both, which is like kind of a cop-out answer, I guess, but it's also true. The open source nature of it is definitely an attraction. An open source project like OpenStack has a broad ecosystem of companies that participate in it, and so that gives you the ability to have options among different vendors. So you could work with Red Hat, or you could work with Orantis. You could, work with Canonical. You could work with EasyStack if you're in China. There are all these different companies, and it gives you options. But it also gives you the ability to drive the direction of the software in a way that you might not be able to if you're buying from just kind of a traditional proprietary technology company. And I think if I look at cloud, the path of innovation in the cloud has really been driven by open source. The sort of, I think, absolute operational excellence in the cloud has been driven by the hyperscale public cloud providers. But sometimes people say, well, Google or Azure or AliCloud or whatever, they're out innovating open source. I don't think that's true at all. I think that they out operate open source. They lower the barriers to adoption. But if you look at, the last 10 years, things that have come out that are state of the art in terms of data analytics, Hadoop, things in the machine learning world, TensorFlow and Cafe2 and Paddle and all of these things, they've all come from open source. The top of the line container technology, Docker, Kubernetes, even things like Mesos and others have all started in open source. And so I think that actually open source is really driving a lot of the innovation. And when I look at OpenStack specifically, if we go back to that example with AT&T, the first cloud that fully supported IPv6 was actually OpenStack. And OpenStack supported IPv6 well before any of the public clouds did, and well before any of the other cloud software did, because Comcast needed it. Comcast is a service provider who runs one of the largest networks in the US. They had to support IPv6, and they were able to go into OpenStack and contribute the code and enable that. And it's like, this is super powerful as a way to make the software do what you need to do. So I think open source is a really big part of it because of the choice that it gives you. And if you want to work with vendors, but it also lets you, I think, control the feature set. It's not just, it's got this feature set I need. It's, I can influence the feature set to something that I need it to be.
Yeah. So off camera, we had talked a little bit about sort of the ethical implications of compute power generally, and why open source might be important to that. Could you tell me a bit about your thoughts on that? I wanted to explore that.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally progress on anything that we're doing as humans relies more and more on computing, whether you're talking about research and science, or whether you're talking about healthcare or our financial systems or our government systems. And so if we create this kind of this tiered capability in the world where people who can pay for it have the top of the line computing, and people who can't pay for it don't have access to that, I think that's actually a really, I think you could even call it unethical kind of way for the technology industry to develop this. And so, like the way I look at it is, it's not that everybody has to use OpenStack or has to use open source, but we absolutely have to make sure that there are options besides just kind of large scale proprietary technology choices. We work in a lot of countries. We have about 105,000 community members in the OpenStack Foundation in 187 countries.
Wow.
And I was in at an event that we did in Budapest that was focused on Central and Eastern Europe. And there are a lot of little countries over there, Slovenia and Slovakia and the Czech Republic and Hungary and little in the sense of compared to say the budget of China or the budget of the US government. And I was talking with some of the people who run technology in these governments, and they said, we don't have the budget to go buy VMware or buy, all of these Microsoft licenses. And so open source, not just OpenStack, but open source gives them a way to modernize their government, to run the technology that they need to serve their citizens that, honestly, like the profit motive isn't there for the proprietary commercial companies.
Right.
And so I think, that open source fills a very important need for the world, because the progress of our species, is dependent more and more on access to technology.
Yeah. So have you seen tangible examples of that happening with OpenStack?
Yeah. So if you look at kind of the Southeast Asian region, there is it's one of the largest population centers on the planet, and there are a lot of rapidly growing and developing economies. But they don't necessarily, again, have kind of the same level of just straight monetary resources that the European Union or the U.S. government has, for instance. And so, within some of those countries, what we've seen are big pushes to go kind of all in on open source strategies, so that they can have top level infrastructure for their telecoms. So there are telecom providers in the region that are running on top of OpenStack. Banks who need to comply with financial regulations that require data to be stored within the country. They have the option now to create clouds within their countries that they wouldn't have otherwise. Those are some of the examples. I think that also, just another area that's of interest to me personally is the academic space, because universities also often have limited budgets, and again, if you look at the sort of top tier elite universities in the U.S., the resources and the access to funding for things is just orders of magnitude greater than if you look at some of the other universities around the world. And yet, that doesn't mean that their students are automatically the ones who have all of the great ideas, who have all of the theories and the sort of research possibilities that could actually really move us forward in whatever area, whatever you want to talk about, medical or science or space or any of these things that are kind of like big problems. And so when we are able to help universities modernize their computing infrastructure and then make that available to their students and to their researchers, I think that's a really, again, very kind of important ethical thing for us as an industry to keep track of and to not lose sight of.
What are some of are you aware of any particular research projects and things that have been going on in the academic sphere with OpenStack?
Probably, there are a lot of them. Probably the biggest one and the most well known is CERN, the European Nuclear Research Agency. So I love the story of CERN. Mark and I, along with some of the other members of our team, were able to go to CERN in May of this year. We got to go down into the Large Hadron Collider, which is the largest particle accelerator. You go,
how cool!
100 something feet underground, and the way that CERN started was after World War II. There was a group of scientists that wanted to kind of rebuild Europe's scientific community. That had really been just demolished by the war. And they also wanted to sort of create a better use, a better ethos around nuclear research, because all of the nuclear research in the past decade had been, how do we create the most powerful weapon and kill the most people? That was like where we ended up with nuclear research in World War II. And these scientists knew that if we didn't just focus on weaponry, which is where all the governments wanted to spend their money, but we focused on what does this mean for our understanding, like our fundamental understanding of matter and the universe, and this kind of thing, like that could be something that's very useful for humanity. So they created this institution, and I love it because I often like to talk about collaboration without boundaries. It's something that we really push for within OpenStack. People from all the companies, all the countries come together. Well, the CERN facility itself is actually spanning the border of France and Switzerland. So it's truly like a collaboration without a border, without a boundary. And they've created these bigger and bigger particle colliders over the years. And now, the way that you get anything useful out of those particle colliders is through computing power. So CERN runs an OpenStack environment that's around 350 or 400,000 compute cores.
Wow.
It does a massive amount of data crunching on every experiment cycle that they do with the Large Hadron Collider. They have incredible amounts of data. When you run the collider ring, it produces every minute like more data than we created as humans up until 2005 or something like that. So the amount of data that they're working with is just insane.
Yeah.
And so you have to have compute that's close to the experiments where the detectors are, to do an initial level of filtering, because there's no way to store that amount of data. And then you store it, and then they go through. And it's a collaboration with hundreds of universities and research institutions around the world. And so to me, that's one of I think the coolest use cases of OpenStack in the research world. Understanding how the universe works and what we're made out of and how we interact with all the particles around us.
Yeah, yeah. So when I was talking to Mark Collier, we were discussing some of the different open source kind of licenses, and I was asking him about, like, since there is no economic incentive, you're not controlling the economics of, like, the point is that there's no payment. You're not requiring companies that use your technology to funnel some of their profits to you. How do you feel about these other companies profiting off of, or institutions like making these big discoveries off of your work without you getting credited? What are sort of your thoughts on that?
I think it's great. and the reason why is I think that, getting back to kind of the idea that there's no such thing as a long-term technical advantage.
Yeah.
I think that also the idea that you can own a technology or control a technology is another false idea. And so to me, it's almost like judo in a way. What you want to do is you want to create an environment that attracts so much interest and activity that it continues to attract interest and activity. And as you do that, these use cases generate economic value, and that feeds this loop where then people will invest in developers who make the software better. When the software is better, more people can make money off the software, and then they invest, and it creates these virtuous cycles. If you look at OpenStack specifically, so we run the OpenStack Foundation, which is a nonprofit, and I mentioned 105,000 community members. The OpenStack Foundation is about 20 or 25 staff members, so it's very, very small in comparison to the community overall. But what we do and what we focus on is kind of coordinating those efforts of this global community. Our last software release, which was the Train software release in October of 2019, it had over 25,000 contributions from 1,100 different developers, from 50 plus different countries, 165 different companies. So, what we do is we kind of help that to continue to function and keep those efforts coordinated through a set of systems that we operate, but also through organizing events, through organizing kind of community discussions to drive it along. And so the companies who are out there, like Red Hat and Mirantis and Canonical, who are making money off of it, they see value in that function, and so they help fund us. And you know, in terms of kind of there is an economic incentive, because if that development process suddenly goes off the rails, stops producing, then that impacts their bottom line. It impacts their products. It impacts what they can sell to their customers. So I think that, you know, the more that people succeed with it, it's actually more incentive for them to make sure that the process continues to work, that the software continues to produce. And that's why I think, you know, sometimes this idea again of in order to benefit from a piece of technology, you need to control it is really just kind of a wrong way to think about it. So
I want to return back to what you'd said at the beginning of that answer, of this idea that that ownership of technology or an idea is kind of fallacious. Can you say more about that? That's a pretty controversial idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and perhaps, you know, I've gone like fully free open source native just in my last decade of time, but I think that for a lot of the technologies that really are kind of fundamental to the way the world works, whether you're talking about like the Linux kernel that has become an operating system, not just for servers, but for really all computing devices. That has created so much more economic value in the world than anybody probably ever realized. And when the Linux kernel was created, what it was actually kind of, you know, not necessarily replacing, but what it was providing an option against was Unix, was proprietary Unix systems. And if you just look at the comparison of the last 25 years of what's happened with Unix versus Linux, I think that we kind of have this longitudinal test that we can look at and see how by making something available in a way where anyone can participate, anyone can build value on top of it, anyone can mix it up and turn it into something else, you create massively more opportunity and massively more economic value. So it's probably controversial, especially in a you know, we're in a geographic region right now where there's lots of money that flows into companies who want to own, you know, a space. What's your business model? Well, I'm going to own this. I'm going to own, you know, automated dog walking or whatever. And I think that if you just look at sort of the actual outcome of what we've seen with some of these projects like Linux and Apache and OpenStack, and you know, you see that it actually does really work, and it is a little bit counterintuitive, but all of these projects have grown and thrived and succeeded by not trying to centralize the control of the projects. Yeah. And you'd also said that control is not really something that's realistic or desirable. So what about, I mean, do you extend these views as far as any kind of IP, like IP law in general should not exist, or what are your thoughts on this space? I think that I don't know. I would have to say I haven't like tried to go through every single possible scenario. I think within the software realm specifically, that a lot of the IP law that is based off of kind of a world of physical inventions, you know, that sometimes take dramatic amounts of money to create factories for, create tooling around, you know, like all that kind of stuff. I think that there are some differences, but I do think that when you're looking at kind of the software and the technology world to some extent, some of those concepts don't really translate as well over. You know, one specific example that kind of gets back to the beginning of OpenStack. So I mentioned that, you know, we had to convince our board that this was a good idea. And one of the things that the board asked was, they were like, well, what's the worst case scenario? Like what would failure be? And we said, well, failure would be if we did this, we went through all of the effort to check our code, make sure that it's all legally clean, that it's safe, that we can do this, that we can license it this way, we're not going to infringe on anything else, and all this work. And we put it out there, and it's harder to work in the open. It takes additional effort. And then what happens is you go and you end up having no one join you because then you've just taken on this, like this extra cost and this extra headache for no additional benefit. And they said, okay, yeah, that we totally get that. That would be failure. Don't let that happen. And so what we wanted to do is we had an initial goal to have 5 companies that would come out in some form of support for OpenStack when we launched it. And this was one of the things that Mark Collier actually led up, was going around and building our ecosystem of partners and companies that were going to participate in it. And when we launched, we ended up having over 20 companies.
Wow.
And just in a matter of months. And one of the things that we discovered as we went through this process was that there was this kind of common experience that a lot of companies had in trying to work with other open source projects, where they came to the project and they said, like AT&T said, well, this project's great, but there's, 10 other things that we needed to do if we're actually going to run it. And they would go and they would write code, they'd put the effort in and they'd say, we want to contribute our code to this project. And whoever the kind of controlling authority was would say, well, no, we don't want that feature in the open source version because we want to sell that in our enterprise version. And so when you sort of build a business model around controlling a project, it puts you into a conflict with your community. And so it always is going to create this limiting and gating factor on who can fully participate in the community, which in turn, my thought is that you go back and you limit the overall potential of your project and the ecosystem around it.
Interesting.
Like OpenStack is they're analyst firms who look at the entire commercial ecosystem for OpenStack, and they have pegged it at almost $8 billion as a global market for OpenStack.
Wow.
Yes, which is massive for an open source project, and that creates a ton of opportunity for many companies to build different kinds of businesses, whether it's public clouds or whether it's a distribution or whether it is by embedding it deep into their existing business, like a China Union Pay or an AT&T. So I think the idea of control. First of all, you have to understand how licensing works. Once you license a piece of software, there is now a version of it that belongs to the world. This is one of, I think, the great benefits of open source. It doesn't belong to any person or company. It belongs to everyone. And so if you go and you go in a direction that your community disagrees with, you can't sort of force them to do what you want. You can't force them to build you a successful business because they'll just take that and they'll fork it, or they'll, take what they've learned and go build their own open source technology. So the idea of control in the first place, like I said, I think doesn't exist. But the second thing is if you try to exercise it, and let's say that you're successful, let's say that, there are approaches with new licenses that are out right now to kind of give certain companies an unequal status within the community, then I think that really puts a bad incentive in place in terms of encouraging cooperation and encouraging engagement. And so, yeah, that's, I mean, the other side of the argument is that when you do that, it means that you have to compete really aggressively against some of the most powerful and well-funded companies out there. But I think that the truth is that's just life. Like, that's life in the business world. You're going to have to do that anyway. I think that, again, this idea of control and this built-in advantage is sort of a fallacy that doesn't hold up in the real world. So
then why do you think that people are so concerned about this idea of control?
Because we're all humans, and we hate the idea that there may be some set of circumstances that we just don't have a say in. I think that's kind of what it gets down to. Because, like, let's say that you are basing a business, you've taken revenue, or taken funding, you're trying to build out your revenue, and that's hard. And so, anything that you can do, any option that you have that you think is going to move the needle on that, you're going to want to go after that. And I think that sometimes saying, okay, well, here is some low-hanging fruit that the open source project doesn't do, that we could build in, that we can charge for, and, that's going to be a great option. A lot of people make money that way, but again, that's kind of a temporary advantage.
Yeah.
And so, sure, you can do a distribution that adds extra value on top. But if you then say, we will never allow that functionality to exist in kind of the core of the software, then you start to break apart the community and you end up, in a way, losing the advantages of open source that we kind of told our board that would be the worst case scenario. Those companies end up with a set of customers. They might make money, they might be profitable, but they're not really getting that network effect of open source from, this kind of coalition of companies working together.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like in general, you're saying that having this open source model makes you immune to a lot of challenges in some ways because your incentives are aligned with your community, and that community now wants to keep you afloat because they're relying on you to some degree. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I think, it creates other challenges too, for sure. Because they're, like within OpenStack, for instance, sometimes, we can take a long time to arrive at a decision. Yeah. Because, it's very much about taking into account the opinions of a lot of people. Yeah. And so, the ideas get debated just as much as the code. The ideas get debated more than the code in some cases. And so there will be something that a company might want to do that is, a valuable use case. But because so many people rely on the software, if you do it the wrong way, then you may be breaking a lot of other customers, a lot of other users, and a lot of other companies. And so the ideas get debated very, very aggressively. And I think that to some people that can seem like a slower process than if you are in a startup and you've got 30 or 40 people and the software developers all sit together and they can just look at each other and talk for 5 minutes and make a decision and go code it. Yeah. But I think that, there's a downside to that, which is you can increase the sort of the velocity of execution, but if you don't have it aimed in the right direction, then you're not really getting anywhere. And I think that with open source, it seems like sometimes maybe the execution happens more slowly, but I think it happens after deliberation that helps to define the direction to some extent. Yeah. So earlier when we were talking about people from different countries who might be using this technology to really enable some basic infrastructure that's super helpful, and that it seems ethical to some degree to provide this as an open source service. At the same time, I'm wondering how realistic it is that OpenStack is able to serve those interests very well if you have a lot of people contributing to the system that are in the community that are from big corporations or just privileged countries in general. How much do they sort of flood the democracy that your community is operating off of? Yeah. Does that make sense? No, it does. And I think that it is a really good question. And it's something that, from very early on within the OpenStack kind of experience, we knew that we wanted it to really be a global and an international project. So we launched it in July of 2010, and in, I guess, November of 2010, we went to China and Japan on this kind of extended trip, and went over there to kind of. There were people already from those countries that were interested in it, and we went over there to support them and say, yes, how can we support you more? And what should we do to encourage involvement, engagement, and there were some things that came out of that we now 10 years on are still doing. So we do between kind of 2 and 4 community events over that time period that are really, oriented around the software development process. And what we have done is we have moved every one of those events. So, we've done them in Texas, we've done them in California, we've done them in Atlanta, in Boston, in Portland, in Vancouver, but we've also done them in Berlin, in Barcelona, in Paris, in Tokyo, in Dublin, in Sydney, in Shanghai, and Hong Kong. And so, I think that one of the things that that our early experiences led us to is that we shouldn't set this up so that, we do a big conference every year in Las Vegas, Nevada, which is how, some companies do it, and some communities, they standardize on where they are. There are definitely benefits to that. But if you are really serious about getting that engagement, you have to, move the core events around.
Yeah.
And we also do a lot of regional events. We've done up to 40 of those in a year in places like I mentioned, Budapest and Hungary and Prague. And, I was in Stockholm a couple months ago, and Korea and Japan, all these places. But the point is that there are actually things that you can do to help not make it just entirely centered around one industry or one geography or one kind of company set. Another thing that we do is we run a lot of our own systems for the development process. So almost none of our software development happens on GitHub, which is kind of, what? Open source and you're not on GitHub. Well, there's a whole world of open source out there that's not on GitHub. OpenStack is one of the 3 most active open source projects in the world, along with Linux, Chromium, and then, an OpenStack. And none of those 3 projects operate on GitHub. So it's kind of funny sometimes that people think GitHub is the center. Now, I love GitHub, by the way, so I'm nothing against GitHub. But we, especially when we started, our level of activity was actually so high that it was difficult to manage it in kind of a more standardized offering like that. So we run our own systems. Those systems are actually run on a set of 8 or 9 different OpenStack public clouds. So they're distributed around the world. So, the code doesn't live in just one single jurisdiction from a legal standpoint, which is very important for a lot of our users. The way that we collaborate, we use a lot of tools that none of which in general are operated by, say, Google, because Google isn't available in the entire world. So it's like if you want, people to be involved, you have to make decisions. And those have incurred extra effort and extra expense and resource investment on our part. But that's why, every event we do, we have people from 50 to 60 countries. Every release, we have contributors from 50 countries. If you look at the distribution of clouds, it's about a third in North America, a third in Asia, a third in Europe.
Wow.
There are smaller percentages in South America and Africa. And same thing from the developer standpoint. Number 1 country for our developers is the US, but at almost exactly the same number of developers as China. And then you get into Germany and France and Japan and other countries. But it is a thing that has been important, and you can influence it, but it takes a desire to do it.
Yeah. Have you ever gotten pressure from certain governments or like you had mentioned being in China as a place with a lot of adoption? Is there ever any tension between an open source company that tries to let everybody do whatever they kind of want with this software and a government that I tend to associate as being a bit more closed down and wanting more control on things?
Yeah. I think that I would say that the interesting thing is we actually have been in the process of opening an office in mainland China.
Okay.
Because we have such a big community there that we need to support that community, and that's very hard to do just entirely from somewhere else in the world. And we have a Chinese community manager who lives in Shanghai, and since we brought him on, it's been extremely helpful. But as we've gone through this opening an office there, there is a higher level of oversight, especially to open something that's an NGO, that's a different kind of structure in China than how you would just do it in the US, for instance. But what's been kind of interesting is we actually had a meeting with one of the government agencies over there that would be part of our regulatory framework, and they said that they had kind of three things that they hoped that we would do, after they had approved our request to open an office there. The first one was that they hoped that we would support efforts around education and research within universities, because that was, that's a very important overall, like, kind of strategic goal for them, is to make sure that they're increasing the knowledge base and the understanding around modern technical systems. The second thing is that they said they would hope that we would work to ensure that there would be continued availability and free access to the software. And the third thing was that they hoped that we would continue to prioritize security and limit the risk of countries compromising the security, inserting backdoors and that kind of thing into the software. So it's interesting because, you're like, well, I kind of think of, and I think that's not an uncommon way to think about it. But when you get outside of the US, a lot of people look at the US and they say, well, this is the government that put backdoors into the fundamental encryption technology that secured the whole internet. Yeah. This is the country that collects more data than anyone ever in history on, the world, and also its citizens. So fair. I know. So I think that, the interesting thing to me is that the requests that we have gotten have actually been very much in line with our values, which are, let's make sure that everybody has equal access to this, that we all care about the same security principles, and, that we're working to kind of use this software to increase the capabilities and understanding and education of technology overall. And this is part of why I believe it's really important to think about that collaboration in terms of how do you collaborate across boundaries. I think that if you go back to the last century, sort of what sometimes people think of as kind of like the golden era of American innovation. Innovation came out of institutions. You had to have an institution that produced the innovation. Yeah. Xerox PARC, or, the DARPA within the US government, or massive corporations like IBM or whatever it is. And I think that we had incredible, technological advances in the mid 20th century. But I think that part of why that was more necessary then is that, the tools for large scale distributed collaboration didn't exist. Yeah. We didn't have email, we didn't have until, at some point we did, but just even simple things like that. And so I think that with the incredible collaboration tools that we have now, whether it's like the opendev.org systems that we run for our projects, or things like GitHub or whatever it is, it makes it a lot easier for you and I to decide that we're going to do something, and we can be in different companies and different cities and different countries, whatever, and still continue to make progress on that in a way that I think was harder before. And so along with that, I think that, to me, we can eliminate some of the risks of that sort of institutional concentrated innovation, where you end up with big disparities between what one group can do and what another group can do. So for me, that's what collaboration without boundaries is really about. It's that the good ideas and the progress, they don't exist within any one community or any one company or any one country. And so we should think about, how do we create a model of collaboration that brings all of those people together. The other reason why I think it's kind of important too is, if you look out over the next 50 or 100 years and you think about what's going to impact our lives every single day, it's going to be computing. It's going to be mobile networks. It's going to be 5G. It's going to be edge. It's going to be AI. I mean, that's a whole other topic to talk about. But these are technologies that we are sort of deploying and promoting and using without really understanding where they're going to take us or how they're going to impact our future. And so to me, to have sort of the experts in all of these areas who are working on this have some forum where they can get together is really important. I think it sort of harkens back to this idea of CERN, where these scientists, they wanted to create an international center where they have representatives from almost every country on Earth who are there, who can talk about a very, very powerful resource and field of science, nuclear research, and do it in a way that's peaceful, and that is thoughtful and that brings together, the experts to work on that together rather than let's do it all in sort of this really competitive way where we view this as something that we need to use against other people. And I think that if we look at the next 100 years, weapons of mass destruction are something that has kind of hung over the world since the end of World War II and really even before that. But I think that in the next 100 years, these kinds of electronic weapons of mass destruction are kind of hanging over our heads. And so if we can create venues, which I think open source projects provide that, venues for these experts to come together, collaborate on peaceful means, governments, armies, the militaries, they're absolutely going to go try to figure out how to use them to kill people. That's like not something that we can stop, but if we can at least make sure that a lot of the minds are thinking about how do we use it for good? How do we think about the risks? How do we talk about that? How do we educate the public? How do we think ethically and morally and all of this about what we do with this? I think that that's another really important part of this kind of collaboration without boundaries.
Yeah.
If we let the trade wars and we let sort of like the nationalistic bents that we've seen in some elections in some countries take us to a state where we develop different internets, we develop entirely different AI ecosystems, we develop entirely different 5G systems where my phone doesn't work anymore when I go to another country. I think that that's a huge step backwards and puts us in a much riskier position of some kind of like just electronic disaster that really does impact lives and killing people, not just sort of in an inconvenient way that I think sometimes we think about, it's like it could be inconvenient if my private Facebook photos or whatever are like, I think this is to me like one of the big things to think about over the next century.
That is fascinating. I mean, there's a lot in that. It was really, really interesting. So first I want to back up to what you had said about how in the last century, like a lot of the innovation was happening by these big corporations that were just like not accountable, moving fast and doing all sorts of crazy things that have benefited society tremendously. Are you suggesting that you think open source or like the collaborative commons, I think like Jeremy Rifkin calls it the collaborative commons, do you think that has the potential to outpace these bigger corporations with closed doors in the foreseeable future?
I think in certain areas it already is.
Okay.
And I mentioned earlier, if you look at again the cloud market, a lot of the innovations that have happened within cloud have happened first in open source. And maybe a hyperscale public cloud doesn't take an open source technology and just run it directly, but in terms of the capabilities, like what you're talking about, I think that they've happened first in open source more and more, in certain areas. I do think that there are still, there are still investments, there are still parts of innovation that are harder to crowdsource, to kind of, bring together in this collaborative commons way. But I think that software specifically is very well suited to it. And I actually think that more and more we're going to see a world where there's almost no proprietary software that beats open source to the market in some way. And if it does, that lead is going to be measured in seconds or minutes, not years or decades. Yeah.
And then when you talk about like this technology being used potentially for bad by like more closed off units like governments and so forth, obviously technology in general is a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. And so it's not difficult to imagine that people are going to collaborate across the world on really negative technologies or pieces of software means as well to perpetuate some of these technological weapons that you were mentioning might kind of be a gloom hanging in the air.
Yeah.
So are you just hopeful that the good people outnumber the bad people in the world, or?
Yeah, I think that just as sort of like a fundamental philosophical bent. I have a leaning towards optimism, and I think that there are definitely ups and downs, but the overall trend is towards freedom. But I think the reason why I think that open source is good is because I think that what aids the progress of freedom is knowledge and information, and so if a government is using OpenStack or Linux or these kinds of tools for something that maybe I personally disagree with, I think that I would rather know that, and I would rather also be able to see what they're using, the software they're using, understand what its capabilities are, because that puts me in a better position to either go debate the right of the government to do that, or the decision of the policy of the government to do that, or if in kind of a worst case scenario, to be able to protect myself better from the consequences of the government doing that. Whereas if you say, well, we've developed this tool and no, you can't use it, that I think that in some governments, they would of course abide by the licensing restrictions that you've put on your open source software. But there are definitely governments in the world who aren't going to care about that at all. And they're going to take your code and they're going to copy it and they're going to, not follow the license agreement. They're going to use it anyway. And so it's at some level, I think that again, we get back to the fallacy of control. and they either take it, don't comply with the license, they rewrite their own, they, whatever that. So to me, you can maybe slightly delay their arrival at that capability, but that won't happen for long. And you may not know about it. You may not know what they're using. And I would rather have the information so that, again, I can think about how I affect that. Yeah. That's my opinion. I know there are a lot of other opinions. So that I definitely, I also think that again, to me, this is one of those things that open source communities talk pretty freely about these kinds of ideas. And it's another benefit of bringing the people together who are building this technology so that we can talk about this and we can talk about the risks. And I think that's, to me, like, information is sort of a very high priority, overall, because I just don't necessarily believe in sort of the ability to really restrict or hide a technical capability, especially from a powerful entity like, a major government. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, information, it's important for everybody to have access to that. A related thought that I had as you were speaking was just that people are tribal. They're just intrinsically very tribal. And so this idea of open source's potential to kind of break some borders down, it makes me think, well, that's going to create some sort of a vacuum. People create other types of tribes, even like political polarization. I know was something we were talking about earlier, that's something that has been fueled by technology and the fact that most people have access to social media, at least in the United States right now. So are you at all concerned that opening up computation in this open source way, and going back to this double-edged,
the downfall of humanity.
Well, heightens the degree of tribalism that it's not necessarily that governments are going to be like, oh, you know what, we all have this computation, this computational platform, let's use that. That maybe they would use that to specifically empower a very specific system that they don't want it to play nicely with other countries or that sort of a thing.
There will absolutely be governments who do that.
Okay.
And I think that the counter to that is to give the people who don't want that to happen the information around what the capabilities are, as well as the capabilities themselves to try to counteract that.
Yeah.
If you talk about kind of social media and, one of the issues with social media and polarization, which this is a conversation that Mark and I have a lot, is he talks about how basically, like, a lot of social media is just programming us like a computer to move farther and farther into a tribe, into an edge somewhere, and because it's built around this sort of AI engine that says,
echo chamber.
what I need to do is I need to drive engagements that create profit and revenue. And the way to do that is to make people like angrier in a way, like the angrier you are, the more you click and the more, like the more money that the social networks make or whatever. And I think that that wasn't the goal of the social networks. And there have been a lot of consequences that have come out of that. But now we at least are kind of understanding that and having a conversation about it. And, the tools that in some cases that are used at these big internet companies are now open source. And now we're having a real, I think, dialogue about what happens when you train an AI system with slightly off data. What happens if it recognizes different races, different nationalities at a different level of accuracy? What happens if we're using this for policing? What happens if and I think again here the openness is actually driving the dialogue so that we can we will always make missteps, and we always have in history. But I think that the openness allows us to recognize that and discuss how do we correct it, how do we adjust it, how do we improve it going forward. And so, yes, to me, again, I go back to just being able to understand what led to this outcome is extremely important, because if we just say we're going to push it all behind the scenes, that's not going to stop a government that is authoritarian, that's controlling from rolling out these systems. They'll still find a way to do it, and we'll just understand less about how it works and why, things are kind of going in a really bad direction. Yeah.
So last question for you is just, what are then some of your next steps and hopes for how OpenStack is going to push that forward?
Yeah. Well, I think, the thing to me that has been really interesting to see is this diversity of use case that we talked about, where we've gone from how do you get a virtual machine as quickly as possible to how do you automate thousands of GPUs, or how do you take hundreds of thousands of physical servers and make them work together? How do you, basically use compute more efficiently? And I think that at some level, infrastructure is kind of boring. You called it invisible infrastructure, and most of the time you don't even know when you're interacting with a cloud, whether it's an OpenStack cloud or AWS or whatever. But at the same time, it's evolving very, very rapidly. To me, one of the really interesting things that's happening is around edge computing. And now we're going to take these data centers and we're going to augment them with smaller data centers, and then additional data centers that are even smaller, and then just single individual computers. One of the use cases for an early OpenStack Edge deployment was inside of a retail coffee chain. They have a little compute node in there that runs the firewall and their point of sale system and their Wi-Fi system and their inventory system, and connects back to the sort of central data center and all this kind of thing. And they want to be able to update that software on a continuous basis rather than sending somebody out with a CD to update the software manually. And so, they basically have built these little OpenStack clouds that are literally on a single server that are this big. To me, that's what's really interesting, is thinking about, okay, where do we take this? Jet Propulsion Lab has actually looked at putting OpenStack onto a probe that they're going to send out for 50 years into space.
Wow.
So again, they can talk to it, update the software, control the systems within this probe. And so I think, to me, the really exciting thing to think about is, where does this go into, again, those new areas that none of us would have ever thought of in 2010 when we first started. And what are the ways that it's going to just impact new industries and use cases and people's lives, overall for the better over the coming years.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you.